and welcome to all our viewers. My name is Mini Dwivedi Gopinathan and I'm the founder and director of PlayStreet, Bangalore, India. I'm a RDI consultant and I integrate my work with sensory motor approach, trauma-informed practice and polyvagal theory. PlayStreet is an organization that provides educational services to help the child with special needs become independent and live up to his or her potential. We offer parent empowerment programs and integrated schooling programs and a variety of clinical services. Since autism and dyspraxia are so tightly coupled, hence the cornerstone of PlayStreet's work is to create many programs and awareness around dyspraxia. In recognition of Autism Awareness and Acceptance Month, our focus is firmly set on the profound significance of dyspraxia. We aim for this series to shed light on the complexities of dyspraxia, address the specific hurdles people with dyspraxia face, and raise awareness about its importance within the neurodiversity movement. Today, we are on the 13th talk of our series under the segment which focuses on invisible effects of dyspraxia. The topic for today is impact of dyspraxia leading to trauma of embodiment. And we are honored to have Ms. Kim Barthel with us to share her valuable thoughts and information on the same. Welcome, Kim. Let me introduce Kim to you. Kim is an award-winning occupational therapist, multidisciplinary teacher, and best-selling author from Canada who is active in supporting people in many contexts internationally. She is a pioneer in reinforcing relational interventions across all sectors. Kim is passionate about understanding complex behavior, neurobiology, trauma-sensitive practice, attachment, sensory processing, mental health, and learning. She has 37 plus years of integrating transdisciplinary, evidence-informed research with a wealth of clinical experience in helping people be their best selves. She's also an advanced MBT OT instructor. Kim's mission is to support the conscious evolution of the human spirit. Today, she's helping us to understand the trauma which individuals with autism and dyspraxia go through. Welcome, Kim, and thank you so much for agreeing to join us for PlayStreet's Autism Hour today. We are honored to have you here.
Thank you. It is an honor to be with you and to dive into these incredible questions that you have posed my way for today's dialogue.
Then what are we waiting for? Let's begin. So, how do we broaden the definition of trauma for children with developmental disabilities? How is it different from classical understanding of trauma, which is bereavement or abuse?
Let me back up two tiny little spots. First, one of the first challenges I had in thinking about this topic was the name of the topic. The impact of dyspraxia leading to trauma of embodiment. And also, for me, it's a circular process. That being in a position of experiencing neurodiversity is in and of itself a potential traumatic experience. But also there is a great degree of vulnerability in being neurodiverse that may lead to trauma. So it goes around, not just in a one-way direction. I wanted to start actually by defining what is trauma. Dr. Gabor Mate, whose definition is one that I align with greatly, says that trauma is not what happens to us, but what happens inside of us when something happens to us. And that's a very interesting definition, a broad definition. And that means that perhaps I could have an experience that is profound, profoundly disintegrating, dysregulating, and if I'm met with support, with co-regulation, with love, with restorative healing experiences around that, it doesn't have to become a trauma memory, a trauma experience. So this is complex. So often people think that trauma is an event, as you've said, that it is a car accident, which it is. Right now, there's a great book that I'm reading called Trauma Impact. And what it is filled with chapters of the impact of trauma in a wide variety of contexts. COVID-19, medical trauma, trauma as a result of loss, developmental trauma. Developmental trauma is the relational traumas that happen while my brain is developing. And so there also is importance here in appreciating the continuum of stress that then can become trauma. When we think about stress, there are in each of us a window of tolerance. Window of tolerance is kind of like your personal coffee cup of how much you can handle. And some of us have a little tiny demi-tasse cup for our espresso. And some have a grande, big cup. And each individual has its own capacity for tolerance and for capacity to regulate themselves in the face of life. And there are many factors that make up our individual capacity. If that coffee cup gets loaded, there's the key word, accumulative loads of ongoing stressors. It's the loads together that can become a traumatic response. So let's say I'm sensitive to sound and my body doesn't work the way I want it to. I have dyspraxia. I have an intention to perform a particular activity, and the instructions don't make it to the end result that I desire. Let's say I am dismissed by the people around me for the experience that I have. They either minimize it or they try to manage my behavior. Let's say we go to the mall where there are so many sensory stimuli. In combination, these multiple levels of stress can together be a trauma. And this is why it's important to have the definition in hand so that people appreciate the challenges that our population experience. If it's okay with you, I'm going to keep going.
I think we should dive into other aspects also. So one term which also I've heard is childhood trauma. So if we can talk a little bit about childhood trauma and how is it different from developmental trauma?
It's not different.
Okay.
Sometimes what happens is the words get mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
That we, different countries and different locations around the world language these things differently. The only real true trauma category in the official Diagnostic Statistics Manual 5 is post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And this is a specific category that was originally developed for veterans coming back from war, specifically in the time of Vietnam. Because these individuals who had such a horrific experience had a set of symptoms. Re-experiencing inability to sleep, easily dysregulated, difficulty staying present, dissociating. These are some of the symptoms that became what people thought of as the impact of trauma. And in the past, well, I've been studying this now for 20 years. In the past 20 years, the terminology of attachment trauma, relational trauma, developmental trauma, childhood trauma, these four basic ways have been the lens through which we've understood the impact of traumatic neural chemistry in the brain and in the body while the brain is developing. And so when you think about these terms, attachment trauma, relational trauma, it means that some of the most significant damage to our brain and to our being occurs within the relationships with our family. And that's hard to hear. It's hard to hear that, especially if you're a parent. I wrote a book with a former hockey player, famous hockey player here in Canada, on developmental trauma, his developmental trauma, sexual trauma, and addiction. And this is not about blame. This is about people doing the best they can with what they have, from what they have learned, that they bring to their parenting. And children with neurodiversity, I'm using that word broadly.
Yes.
Because it's easier for me to appreciate the co-occurrence of autism, of ADHD, of dyspraxia, of Tourette's, right? That all of these things, they are part of the brain wiring that we often see in autism. So the neurodiverse brain is difficult inherently to attach to because it's so different in its reception of sensory cues, of attachment cues. And a parent may not know how to dance, I'm using that word metaphorically, in relationship with their child who's wired differently. And the parent may also experience grief and loss for having a child that is not what they dreamed of. And these attachment fingers affect the child's sense of self, who they are in the world, how they experience relationships. And this gets coded in the brain very early and
Yes.
layered in with the diagnoses that our kids get. Is there more about that you want to know, or was that?
I think this was very good information. So you used few difficulties which people with PTSD they face, like sleep disorders, severe anxieties, or detachment, or dissociation. It's not that I do not see these traits in the children I work with. I see these things in people with autism too. So I think from here emerges the second question. So I would like you to help us define dyspraxia from trauma-informed perspective. Because I think I got this statement in one of your workshop only, that for children with autism and dyspraxia, embodiment is trauma. Yes.
There's a number of reasons. First of all, inherently, in a neurodiverse wiring, embodiment is difficult. Right from, they're synonymous. And what do we even mean by embodiment? Embodiment means feeling into myself, knowing that I am a self. our sensory systems in developing brains in utero, even at that time in development, we begin structurally to know that I am separate from you.
Yes.
Unless I don't, unless my sensory systems develop differently and my boundaries between me and the world around me become unpredictable, insufficient, continuously terrifying. So the sensory systems are a very profound aspect of embodiment. And we regulate emotions and thus behave in a way of connection and engagement only by connecting to the body. This is such a big concept that the world doesn't quite yet get, that you cannot regulate with your thoughts alone. And in fact, that is the slowest path to regulation.
Yes.
And that when we ask a question like, why are you doing that? Or we give a direction like, stand on one foot, hop 3 times, and follow this obstacle course. That this demand actually is in of itself not accessing the regulation circuitry. Because when we feel a feeling like sadness, shame, anger, the only way to regulate that emotion is to feel it in my body. So this is why embodiment is so important. Now, our kids with sensory challenges, especially dyspraxia, because dyspraxia is it's reliant on embodiment.
Yeah.
Means that I'm going to struggle with processing the senses of what I feel, how do I move. I'm going to have trouble putting thinking together with sensing. And here's where it overlaps with trauma. When you have early developmental trauma, especially in infancy, and people may say, well, how does an infant have trauma? If there's yelling and screaming around you as a baby, if there is conflict in my home, if there is a sense of neglect where I am on my own, then the part of the brain that develops embodiment is altered by experience, not just how I came into this world. And so here's the piece where they overlap. I may have a neurodiverse wiring and also have developmental trauma. And they can come together in this path. And what can I do as a baby? I can't fight, I can't flight. I can only dissociate, which means I leave my body. I disconnect. And when I do that, what happens is I become even less embodied. And so the problem can become worse and worse and worse. So here I am, a wee one, and I do things differently, and we unknowingly come along with frustration. Look at me, do this, behave this way. Each hit is a stressor that can result in more disembodiment.
Sometimes I feel too much of language, too much of instructions, too much of prompting also leads.
Especially because it is typically perceived as demand.
Yes. So then what exactly is trauma-informed sensory motor approach? I mean, if any such term exists.
Yes, I mean, there are different sort of frames of reference. When I read that question, I was thinking, well, here at Relationship Matters, we created a theoretical frame of reference called psychosensory intervention, which is a form of more than a trauma-informed sensory motor approach, but it would fit under that umbrella. There's also Elizabeth Warner's SMART, which is a sensory motor approach. There's Safe Spaces, which is Teresa May Benson and Sarah Sawyer. So there, and Marty Smith, people who are thinking about how do the sensory systems create trauma, and also how does trauma create sensory disorder? How do they fit together? And so knowing that so little of this regulatory system is cognitive, it really does demand that we look at the body, which is, what we see in dyspraxia, that we look at how the body moves, that we look at how the sensory systems are being processed, integrated, especially integrated. And that treatment can then help together with in my approach, a psychotherapeutic co-regulatory force that helps give the child a new experience of relationship, a new experience of engagement, a new experience of safety in their body and in the world.
We have brought sensory processing into this question. So I think that's what we'll go into now. So I will ask some specific questions connecting sensory processing, dyspraxia, and trauma. And what I have understood so far, that tactile system is really a very important sensory system. What we understand about tactile system, I think, is so little, but the amount of contribution tactile system has in this matter, what we are discussing today, I think is huge. So please help us to understand the role of tactile system in the development of safety and efficient sensory motor outcomes. How is it affected in population with dyspraxia and autism, or just autism, or just dyspraxia, or any neurodiversity?
When you think about, most people don't know this, but there are specific neural fibers, little neurons, wires, like fiber optics,
Yes,
that go from the skin to the brain that are specifically designated for what we call affective touch. Touch that is in the context of relationship. So if you think about it for a moment, a baby is hungry, they have pain, and I'm using a baby as an example because this is how it forms. And the caregiver goes, "Oh, you're hungry. I see you're hungry. Let me pick you up." And through the communication of touch, there is an intent of soothing that is felt by the skin, that is immediately coded in the brain with a resultant chemical called oxytocin, which is the chemistry of love. And that oxytocin is the best chemical we have in our body to actually feel safe. So love equals safety. And the challenge with a neurodiverse brain, autism, dyspraxia, or co-occurring things, is that often those fibrous networks are different. In fact, there are 2 research studies that I know about that have actually looked at the actual skin, a biopsy. Doesn't sound like fun, does it? A biopsy of these little neurons within the skin, and that people with autism actually have less of them. Some in this study, which makes it challenging to sometimes glean the benefit of the affective intent. And many parents who are trying to support their children know this, that they go to reach or hold their children, and it doesn't seem to land in the same way. Alternately, touch is the fastest path to calm. And so if that is also in a container of roughness or frustration or disappointment or emotional contexts where the parent in their attachment pattern is not activated in the soothing engagement way, this completely alters the CT fibers in the skin, and touch no longer becomes safe. And we have for a very long time called this only tactile defensiveness. And I want to say there is such a thing as true tactile defensiveness, but there is also relational defendedness, which is bigger than just touch. And it comes through multiple sources of data in the relationship, how you use your face, how you use your voice, and how you use your hands. In meeting the child that you have in front of you, so that if I have a child whose touch system struggles, I have other channels I need to accentuate to create sense, to create safety. And rather than being activated myself as an adult at the rejection feeling, the information of knowing that the wiring is different may help me connect to my child in a new way. So the touch system is the first boundary of our body. And if I can't tolerate that, then I am also going to struggle with boundaries. Sometimes I'm going to touch everybody or everything all around me because I won't know how to discriminate what it is I'm feeling. When we also understand how touch is part of the somatosensory map of me, which is critical to dyspraxia. If I don't discriminate what I feel well, then my use of tools, pencil, toothbrush, spoon, AAC, it's going to be hard. And so the tactile system becomes a priority to create a way for that child to inherently improve. I know you're going to ask me how.
Of course, because that when we are with our children, it's so natural for us to touch them. And if that particular thing is going wrong, then you see the effect everywhere. So definitely that one strategy, how it's I think I mean it is required to be answered here.
Sure.
Yes.
And I think what's important about the tactile processing is as I feel more safe, period, the capacity to explore enhances. So that's the how to the what. So let's say my goal is that the child will explore their environment through their hands, when they're little, through their mouth, safely, moving their body through space, right? Safety is the doorway into exploration Fear is the pathway to avoidance. What I want to do is emotionally, environmentally, cognitively create a just right, safe opportunity where the child has the freedom to be who they are and continue to become their best self. And this is most effectively accomplished in day-to-day natural environments. And requires, of course, a tremendous amount of co-regulation on the part of the people that you're with, who, delight in you, who offer but not require. These are difficult skills to shift the how, but that's where safety then affords the child the natural experience of feeding their own nervous system.
I think if I want to add one point here, along with the touch, I think validating child's feelings, I think helps a lot.
Sure. And I
Yes.
mean, one of the questions I know that you have in your mind is how do we, if something bad happens to our kids, what do we do? And
Yes.
the formula is validate the experience, hold space for the emotion, and then create a containment of it. Move on so that the child knows that there's a beginning of you understand me, you see me, you feel me, and I am validated and loved by you. And then the holding of space is the part that's varies in duration, where the child is processing what has happened to them. And sometimes a major meltdown may in fact be an accumulation of days of stress. And we often think it's what happened a moment ago. You might have just tipped the iceberg and the child's explosion. It's like, why? What just happened? And it might be this spilling over of the coffee cup. So the holding of space is a big part of the safety, where I don't move you on too quickly because it can be very dismissive. And the child doesn't learn to feel uncomfortable, which is what regulation is. Feeling comfortably uncomfortable. And then this could go on. And as you start to see it shift as a parent or a teacher or a therapist, you go, let's go do this. And then the mind will be ready for a new offering. And so this is the formula of everything that we do, really, over and over again.
Thank you for sharing this. I hope this piece of information really contributes to not only to the parents but to therapists also, that what do they do when such situations arise.
And you'll get more
Hmm.
performance from offering versus demanding.
Exactly. So let's move to the next sensory system. And in my understanding, I think the sensory system, another sensory systems which bring trauma to individuals with dyspraxia is auditory system. So how is vestibular cochlear system or vestibular auditory system embedded to bring basic sense of self, physical and emotional competency? And does it help with the does it help the individuals with an ability to organize the body relative to the environment?
This is I'm very mindful of this question. I'll tell you why. I was reading an interview of an adult who is non-speaking, using AUC, who had an interview about their experiences with sensory. And this woman called us, meaning the therapists and the parents, people who are not neurodiverse, people who have sensory systems that they think are typical. Okay, I love how she said that. And she said, my therapist thinks that a sound in the environment is too loud for me. But she said, in my world, that sound is just that sound. And the volume or the frequency isn't the sensitivity. It's that moment by moment, different experiences land in my brain as a priority. So at 1 second, the bird that flies by out the window becomes the priority of my nervous system. The next second, it's the sound of the horn on the car. And then in the next second, it might be a piece of dust on the floor. And it's not that I'm sensitive to these things, it's that I don't put them, this is what she said, together as a whole. And that each bite of sensory information is distinct and unique and unpredictable. And then I know, she said, cognitively, I know that I need to follow the instructions of my teacher, or I need to, get up and put on my clothes. And my brain cannot filter, organize, and it's too frequently interpreted as a sensitivity. Now, you asked about sound. Sound is a survival sense. So just like touch. But sound is all about where is it? This tiny bit above the spinal cord in your brainstem is a huge structure that is deciding, is that a saber-toothed tiger that is coming to eat me? Or is that the sound of my mother's voice? And this wiring, it immediately puts me into fight or flight or approach. And this is what we see. We see our kids processing sound bites, and their brains, without consciousness, there's no decision in it, is moving away or towards a sound. Many of our kids cover their ears, not because they don't like the sound or that this frequency hurts necessarily, but because if I shut down one sense, I can at least handle the barrage of data that I'm trying to contend with. And so many kids cover their ears when there's too much light. Many of our kids cover their ears when they have to move through space. So I really truly think that in dyspraxia, it's more of an integration problem where senses don't come together to give us a holism of experiences in the way that you and I perceive the world. And so this is why I think that system is so front and center, is because of its role in discerning, is the environment safe or not? That's what it's designed for. Its design for language is so late in the game. Trying to process language is so down the road compared to safety, that if safety is my priority, language detection becomes so much harder.
I mean, even listening to this is making me feel that it's just too much of difficulty. And again, of course, how can we help? Anything, any tool, anything available which can help our children.
Well, you know, one of the things that is being said to me over and over again is stop asking for tools. The neurodiverse affirming practice and trauma sensitive practice are almost the same thing.
Okay.
It invites us to be curious. What is happening for you? And instead of what the neurodiverse population is asking is stop trying to fix me and be with me in my experience. Be curious about my experience. Now, let's say I have a child that is not able to communicate.
Mm.
Doesn't mean that I don't want to add to their life more capacity for them to increase their safety and connection. It's the how I do it. It comes with the acceptance. I'll give you a very basic example. I have a young man on my case load in his 30s who has severe dyspraxia. As he walks down my driveway, he will get stuck. So as he walks down the driveway and has to step over an object, his ability to motor plan that has him dysregulated and pause. And he has an amazing sibling who is almost in his skin. So I watched his brother come alongside, and as my client would get stuck, the brother would cue his sibling with his foot. Just give him a tap on the back of the foot. And then I watched the brother rock a little bit. And then his dyspraxic sibling began moving again.
So they're accessing the auditory system through the tactile system?
They're using tact, vestibular,
Yes.
auditory,
Yes.
whole body experience to not developmentally change the person, but to come alongside them.
Yes.
And that's where that component of validation comes on. Right?
I mean, this was such a new piece of information what you told me, and thank you, Kim, for this perspective and sharing this experience. Um, Again, I attended your vestibular visual series, and in that series, I learned how impacted the vestibular visual system is. So, what is the impact of vestibular visual system on the traumatic experiences of children with dyspraxia or and autism like neurodiversity?
Question could have me here for a month. But one, again, this is a mix of the vestibular system is affected in dyspraxia, but the vestibular system is highly affected by trauma. And so again, if we layer these two things together, then what we see is a person who doesn't know where they are in space. And all of the work of cognitive neuroscience and consciousness. Consciousness means I'm a me, separate from the world, begins in the vestibular system. And that's the work of Christoph Lopez and his colleagues, who have deeply found that the sense of my relationship to gravity is the beginning of knowing that I'm in a world. And our clients deeply struggle with this. Where do I begin and where do I end? And how do I move through the world? And as you said, vestibular and visual are not separate.
Yes.
So how I move my head helps me organize my eyes so that I can hold my gaze, I can make eye contact, I can read a page, I can decode words. All of the things that I do with my eyes rely on my vestibular system. And vision is so difficult for people with neurodiversity. They do not see the world in the way that we do. Many times they see it as flat. Imagine moving through space, reaching for your toothbrush. When you see the world as flat, two-dimensional, it is going to require a completely different prioritization of your sensory systems. And it will slow you down, make you clumsy, make you awkward. And as a result, when you have trauma, and we talked about trauma and disembodiment, your vestibular system drops in its impact on muscle tone. Trauma deeply impacts our postural system. It can make us floppy, because if I'm in a chronically depressed, dissociated, shameful space about who I am, then the messages from the vestibular system to the muscles deactivate. And my already existing weak inner core can become even less accessible. If I'm in fear, then I get more tension in my muscles. And that also decreases my coordination. So this trauma movement system interaction is big. And not just from the sensory perspective, but a motor execution perspective. And having dyspraxia makes me feel bad about myself, because things are hard.
I was just thinking that not only just the children, but even the families in which the children are diagnosed with any kind of neurodiversity. So the parents, those who go into trauma, you can see the change in their tone and their postural systems. And I mean, that is what is my observation. What do you, have you observed it?
Absolutely.
Right, yes.
You asked me once, how do parents transmit their trauma from one generation to the other? Well, sometimes we transmit it in our genes, in our DNA, but we also do what we know, what we learned. So the very things that we learned from our experiences as children is layered into our parenting. And there's no roadmap to parenting a child with neurodiversity. There's no manual. And as a parent, it changes your entire life.
Yes.
Like I said, your grief, your loss. And often it's my experience, especially in teaching in India, that there is this belief that if I work harder, I'll get there. If we just keep working, and it's like I'm going to use my will to get my kiddo to catch up. And this is honorable, I get it, and have deep compassion for that. And as a clinician, it is important to have space held for a parent and space held for a child. And they don't always look the same. And that's the bigger piece of the work of supporting families with kids with special needs.
I know, Kim, that as you told, each question is work of many days workshop. But rationale here is to just help our families to understand that how all this is so important. So, so that they can understand their children better, and so that they can really choose more co-regulation and more trauma-informed practice. So the whole rationale of bringing this conversation is to create that awareness, because this information is so new and so noble. So now let's move to proprioception and interoception. So please help us to understand the role of proprioceptive information and interoception to know one's own body. And how is this whole process is inefficient in children with dyspraxia? And one more layer which I'm hearing these days is earlier we used to hear proprioception is through muscles and joints, but now fascia is also we have started to talk about fascia also. So yeah, I mean, so what is the role of fascia in this whole?
I think it's important to even know what fascia is. I mean, for many years, the term proprioception was like, what is that? The little receptors that are in our muscles and joints. And fascia weaves in 3 dimensions through our whole body. Underneath our skin, in our skin, around each cell, around each organ, in the muscles, between the muscles. And what we know now is that you have more proprioceptors in your fascia than you do in your muscles and joints. And so every time you stretch or bend or move, or there is a force, a mechanical force in the fascia. And the proprioceptors send data back to the brain that say, this is the load on my body in this moment.
Hmm.
In addition, fascia is loaded with neural receptors for chemicals that help create emotions. This is the mind blower. That we believe that implicit memory, which is memory, embodied memory of things that have happened to us, actually gets stored in our fascia more than in the little file drawers in our brain. That implicit memory, that body memory, is ever existent, running in the background like Norton antivirus, and is a shadow to how I experience the world. We see some of our kids, they walk through the world with a forward poking head, a posterior pelvic tilt, a curved spine, open hands. Their body position influences their emotion and vice versa. So proprioception is part of that interoceptive sense of me. Because the term interoception actually is not just what's happening inside of me, but what is happening inside of me in relationship to what is happening outside of me. And so all of our senses contribute to interoception, but our fascia has a leading role, let's put it that way, in normal plain speak. It has a very big representation in the brain of how I understand what I'm feeling. And what I'm feeling means, am I hungry? Am I sad? And the biggest challenge here in this dialogue is there is a strong realization that ableism, which is a priority for those who are non-neurodiverse in the world, is actually a trauma. And that every time someone looks at you or looks away from you or creates a disgust face, pulls their nose away, turns their face that your brain gets hit with a stress response. And that becomes reflected in your fascia. And we're not going to control all that, I realize, but through awareness, one tiny step at a time, we can help people feel that who they are is fully acceptable in the world, in addition to the differences that we all have. So proprioception is this sense of feedback that I get from my body in the world. And so when you're more excited, you get more proprioceptive feedback. When you're sad, the proprioceptive feedback shifts. there's less activation, there's a strong connection between emotion.
I don't even have words now to appreciate your answer, and it's such a mind-blowing awareness for me, and I hope it is for the audience too. So now let's move to arousal. So please help us to understand the impact of sensation, cognition, and emotion on arousal and stress. So how does it affect individuals' functioning? If possible, various functional areas like eating, feeding can also, I mean, you can touch upon that.
Well, arousal is the energy in your brain and in your body that gets you ready for moment by moment engagement in the world. And our levels of arousal, energy, have to match the demand of what's asked of us. And this is hard when you're differently wired. And so our arousal systems are constantly, I say our, as in every human being, are being upregulated and downregulated like a little dial on a soundboard, like a synthesizer in a concert, where I'm adding energy or taking away stress so that I can meet the demand of the task. And this is fine tuning. It's a lot of constant dial setting in order for me to accomplish that. And there are circuits in the brain that link up sensation, cognition, and emotion. In fact, the brain is not a stepladder. It is a predictor, and it's anticipating. What am I going to do? That's what praxis is. It's a feed-forward system of prediction. And so if my arousal system can't adjust, either I don't have enough energy through my body, I have too much stress in my emotions, or the cognitive demand of the task is outside of the capacity of my executive functions, then the dots don't line up for me to be able to do those adaptive skills. And this shows up in eating and feeding. It shows up in dressing. It shows up in the classroom. It shows up on the playground. It shows up in every respect. And so arousal is always a part of the holistic aspect of evaluating any situation. Am I in a space where I can connect into what is asked of me? And so therapists, parents, and eventually individuals themselves have the ability to analyze. One of my clients said the other day, the cognitive load for me is so high because I'm constantly thinking, am I saying this in a way through their masking? Am I saying this in a way that is going to be received by the other? How do I stop this person from knowing that I'm neurodiverse? How do I hide my challenges that I've got? It's exhausting to use your cognition for that when your brain is already struggling in, how do I get my muscles to be coordinated enough to lift my leg to get on my bike, right? So this is what is meant by those three variables that interact together. With respect to eating and feeding, I'm just wondering if there is something more you wanted me to say.
We have seen in people with autism, picky eating is very, very prevalent. And of course, it's sensory and motor in nature, but I feel sometimes it's because of the trauma of force feeding or things like that. So might be it's the past experience with the caregiver or some negative experience of that food which I don't think some of us understand. So that's why I wanted to bring this eating and feeding in context, that force feeding is not the solution. So I think that's the reason perhaps I asked you to touch upon it, that trauma is such an important part. It is along with sensory and motor.
I think that that's perfect.
Yes.
The three areas of life
Mhm.
most indicative of regulation are eating and feeding, sleeping, and toileting. And these three areas of regulation are highly affected by relationship and attachment. So attachment trauma, developmental trauma will show up in those three regulatory functions more than anything. There's nothing worse than not being able to feed your child.
Yes. True.
And deep compassion for parents who sit at the table for hours just hoping that their child will eat something. It is such a difficulty because it becomes so personal. I'm a bad parent. And so that whole attachment relationship is fraught with out of sync goodness of fit. And that layers in to my avoidance of eating. And eating is something I can control. So if I feel out of control, at least I can control something.
Yes, because I really wanted to bring this point for parents to really understand it. So let's move to the next segment now. Sensory processing was such an important piece of trauma, understanding trauma. Now I want you to little bit talk about parents' trauma. How does parents' trauma contribute to children's trauma?
Yeah. Well, we all have blind spots. My colleague Theo Fleury says, if you have parents, you need therapy. I think, as a parent myself, to a daughter who is a counselor, it's impossible to not have our children have some aspect of their experience be a part of their personal growth. Impossible. And again, there's a continuum to this, right? So I don't want this dialogue or this question to make it sound like there is a utopic way. And according to Winnicott, who's a very famous attachment theorist, 20% of the time is good enough. Thank goodness. And it's that feeling of being received and seen and valued that is all the essence of our safety. So a parent needs to know that if they do something that is a rupture in the relationship, that the repair is more important than doing it perfectly in the first place. That's what makes security solid, is knowing that a relationship can handle conflict and challenge, and that the relationship is still intact. Now, many parents bring to their parenting their own history of neglect, their own histories of perfectionism, their own histories of pressure and compliance, thinking that this is how the person develops. If I just criticize you a little more, you'll try harder. We are only now beginning to understand, for example, the impact that has on the brain. And so that this is not something that we could have known 25 years ago. That if I continuously face this feeling of, you're not good enough, that becomes my inner perception. So parents do it, we all do what we know. And inevitably, it may not always value the child. Alternately, boundaries are critical. I think people think that trauma-sensitive perspectives are boundaryless. Fluffy, nurturing, I'm just nice to my kid all the time. They get to do what they want. Absolutely not. Because a significant part of safety is knowing what's okay and what's not okay. And it's again the how. Creating those boundaries without shame. That you are not your behavior. I love you, but what you just did there is, you just hit your brother, you bit your brother. That's not okay. But you are okay. So I think that when we talk about how parents bring their trauma into the parenting role, I think that conversation belongs to humanity.
In the therapy centers, how can therapists sometimes unintentionally contribute to child's trauma?
Ah, yes, we do. A lot of, I don't know, as I speak to my colleagues out there, we often only feel good enough if the child performs. If the parent is happy with us, especially in a private practice context, which I know that is so common, that our feeling of pressure from the parent to create a child that is normal, we can pick that up and put that in our own backpack. And that can become the filter with which we work with the child, which is another layer of potential dysregulation and trauma. So a trauma-sensitive clinician has the role of holding on to the value that relationship is their superpower, and that their theoretical frame of references are important, constantly informing them, but that the relationship is the key, is the tent pole of the entire process, that is where the child will feel the potential, their potential.
I think that's the reason it's very important to understand therapist burnout also. So making sure of well-being of therapists is so important to maintain the well-being of the children and families.
Totally. It's a tall order, especially
Yeah.
when you're, I don't know, 12 cases a day. So
Not a
difficult.
not a joke, yeah. Yeah, true. So, Kim, though it was such a complex topic and such a vast topic, but we have managed well. And we have come to the last question. If one thing, just one thing that can be done in the time of crisis, then what would you suggest the caregivers and the therapists to do it when a child is out of his or her window of tolerance?
First thing that the adults need is self-compassion. I think this is the greatest interrupter of reactivity. That if I can find compassion, if I can connect to my own self, gosh, this is happening to my child, or oh my gosh, this is happening to me. That feeling of this is tough. And then the second, what would you say to your best friend? You need to say to yourself. And that self-compassion as an adult increases your capacity to hold space for others. So the only person we can change is ourselves. And when we are with our kids, we do the best we can with what we have in helping them see themselves through our eyes of love. So that's my answer.
And it couldn't be better than this. So we are done with the questions. Kim, would you like to tell our viewers about your trauma-informed practice course? I think they should know about it because I personally feel that everybody should attend it. So it would be good if it comes from you only.
Thank you, Minnie. Humbly, this is life's work for our company, Relationship Matters. And we have a series called Trauma Sensitive Practice. And we call it Trauma Sensitive Practice because trauma informed lives up here. It's a bunch of concepts. And trauma sensitive is a life mission. It's a way of being in the world. And so our series helps, I believe, people become more open and aware to their own biases, their own values and beliefs, and gives a tremendous number of tools for self-care, as well as how to be more curious about those around us. And so you can find our series online at www.kimbarthel.ca. You will find it listed in our courses offered.
Thank you so much. I hope all the viewers, those who are watching this interview, consider attending this training. So we have come to the end. And on behalf of the PlayStreet team, I would like to thank you, Kim, for taking the time to share your insights and expertise with us today. Your perspectives have really added valuable depth to our understanding of impact of dyspraxia leading to the trauma of embodiment. To our viewers, we hope you found this interview insightful. If you have any questions or would like to share your thoughts, please feel free to connect with us. At PlayStreet, we offer a very special program called the Dyspraxia program, which encompasses intensive occupational therapy, of course, various aspects of speech therapy, physiotherapy. Program, basically a sensory rhythm-based music and a movement program to bring the rhythm part at the front, which is called upbeat, and most important, co-regulation. So, so if you feel that your child might have dyspraxia, please feel free to contact us for further details. Thank you again for being a part of this conversation. And thank you, Kim, for being with us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.